So Hosea chapter 11, we're going to go ahead and finish up the chapter. Then we'll read through chapter 12 and get started there. Okay. So we're picking up in verse 9. I believe verse 9, right? Yeah, verse 9. You know, last week we were talking there in verses 5 through 8. They're not going to learn, they won't return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria. He will be their king. They refuse to return to me. Now, initially, remember, it seemed like a contradiction because they were going to Egypt, but they were not going to Egypt. But the idea with them going to Egypt was the type of bondage that they were going into, the slavery, when in fact it was going to be Assyria. And there the sword will whirl against their cities, talking about the Assyrian army coming through and the complete destruction that they're going to face. My people are bent on turning from me, though, verse 7, though they call them to the one on high, none at all exalts him. In verse 8, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? Remember, Ephraim, we're talking about the northern kingdom of Israel here. But though they call them, talking about though the prophets are calling the people to come back and worship God. Remember earlier in the book, the people are told to contend with your mother, to contend with the authorities. We have the priests, many who are also becoming corrupt to the point to where they're gathering in small groups and robbing people along the way. And the prophets, you know, are delivering the word of God and say, you need to turn back to God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Remember Leviticus 11 verses 44 and 45, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Therefore you're to be holy, for I am holy. They weren't doing that. Right? They were sacrificing to false idols. I don't know why I say false idols. All idols are false, aren't they? So they were sacrificing to idols. Just force of habit. And even to the point to where they were sacrificing their children. Everything that they had received, whether it was the grain of the field or their livestock, or they gave glory to the idols for that and not to God. That's why he said back there in chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, that he was going to take it all away. And he says, and then he starts to have this kind of, it switches between the third person and the first person. And then here in verse 8, God's kind of having this talk with himself, very much as a parent. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me. All my compassions are kindled. And so there's this distraught, and it very much is like a parent who has a child. They have done everything that they possibly can for their child. They have fed them, they have clothed them, they have taught them, they have guided them, and yet at every turn the child turns away and wants to do what's wicked. And that parent, what am I going to do with this child? If it were me, what am I going to do with Annie? Or what am I going to do with Austin? That type of thing. So it's entering this self-questioning here because, it's coupled with the compassion for them. It's like, what else could I possibly do? And we might even translate that same mentality over to, the New Testament and even to where we are today. People say, I want this from God. I want this from God. I want this from God. He gave us his son. What more could he possibly do? What more does he have to do? He didn't even have to do that. But he did. And yet we still want more. We're still never satisfied. And remember, some of those cities that we were talking about, they were surrounding, Sodom and Gomorrah. But did anybody have any questions regarding last week, what we talked about? Or, maybe you read it and had something come up before we pick up in verse 9? Okay, then. So verse 9, I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again, for I am God and not man. That right there, I am God and not man, should tell you the type of God that he is. The Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. Now, the verse, it could be translated as, I will not carry out the fury of my wrath. I won't again destroy them. I think it's the NIV translation that says, nor will I turn and devastate Ephraim. And it said he's not going to destroy them. But the answer to all of these questions, it comes from the fact that the text presents Israel as being in danger of repeating the history of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities on the plain. I will not carry out the fury of my wrath. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be punishment. Just that it is not going to be the extent of what came to Sodom, Gomorrah, and the other cities on the plain. There's still going to be punishment, but they're not going to be completely obliterated from the face of the earth. Now, why might that be the case? Why would God not just wipe Israel off the face of the planet? There is people. Yeah, there's the covenant promise. Remember, Genesis chapter 12, that's where it begins, that covenant promise with Abraham. That he's to leave his father's house and leave the kin and everything he's known, everyone he's known, and go into a land that God's going to show him. God doesn't break his promises. Right? Does he? And so even though Ephraim, even though Israel has done all these horrible things and they've bent themselves toward denying him, they're inclined toward denying him, and even though punishment is coming, or discipline we might say, because the Lord disciplines those whom he loves, he's not going to completely destroy them because he made a promise. Has he made any promises to us here? Okay, well, what might one of those promises be? Or name off a couple. Right? The faithful get to go to heaven. You had to pick the big one, huh? Absolutely. If we're faithful, Revelation 2 and verse 10, we generally just kind of go with part of that verse. But if you remain faithful unto death, then you'll receive the crown of life or of righteousness, depending on your translation. But never leaves us, never forsakes us. Yes, ma'am? No. Great, we got Jinx in here. That's awesome. But absolutely. And no matter how much, and I want to be careful saying this, because I don't want people to get the opinion that no matter how bad we are, that we can't fall away, because we can certainly fall away, right? There's a different covenant promise with Christ than there was with the people of Israel. With us, it's being faithful. For example, Jesus says, if you love me, what? Keep my commandments. What does John say about Christ's commandments? They're not what? They're not burdensome. We make them difficult. We make them difficult because we get outside of this. And yes, we do need to study our Bible. We need to consider the language and the thought behind the text. But ultimately, I don't care how many letters you have after your name, you could have the entire alphabet and still miss God. The people of Israel had God with them the entire time, even though they didn't think he was there with them in Egyptian bondage. They had all of this and yet completely missed him. Jesus had, we'll just talk about the inner circle, the apostles there, and yet Judas completely missed him. So he says that he's not going to bring off this full wrath, and there's going to be punishment there. So he's not saying I will not come in wrath, is that I will not come in my full fury, if that makes sense. Again, there's going to be discipline, but he's not going to completely obliterate them from the planet. In this idea, the point that God, Yahweh, is God and not man, he's holy, it really is remarkable. You know, when we consider the holiness of God, the enormous number of events and times that God either declared himself or showed himself to his people, to the camp of Israel, demanding that they be holy. For example, they were to keep everything that was said. Let's see here, Deuteronomy 23. Deuteronomy 23, just as an example here, verse 14. Since the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and to defeat your enemies before you, therefore your camp must be holy, and he must not see anything indecent among you, or... What, did anybody else turn there? Or he will turn away from you. Is that not a warning for us, even today? With everything that God has done, what do we say when we come to worship services? That we come before the throne of God, we're in the presence of Almighty God? Do we really believe that God is everywhere? Or just that he resides in this building, even though he says, he doesn't reside in this building necessarily, right? Heaven is his throne, earth is his footstool. That's true. But he says, in Deuteronomy 23:14. Yes, sir. He is there to deliver us, and so we have to keep things holy. We have to pay attention. We are, as Peter would say, a royal priesthood. Could you be an unholy priest and still get away with it? Still get away with any type of discipline? They thought that they could here in Hosea. But God said, no, it's coming. Punishment is coming. And it may not be right then. See, our problem as people is that we tend to think because punishment is not immediate, that it's not coming at all. There are plenty of people on this planet and who are here now and have been in the past who lived according to worldly standards, a luxurious life, lots of money, lots of popularity, all of this type of stuff. Never had a problem, really, because money solves everything after all, right? But they weren't there with God. And then they die and they figure it out. Punishment is there. Might not be immediate, but it's there for those who don't follow our time, the cross. Yeah. Oh, sure. And Clark and I, we were actually talking about this before class started, and you've heard me say it before. If people looked at the relationship with God, yes, he is God. Yes, he is holy. Yes, his ways are not our ways. Isaiah 55:8-9. But if we look at it in the familial relationship of a parent to a child, then God becomes that much clearer and that much simpler to understand, really. I do something wrong, I get punished. It doesn't mean that my mom or dad doesn't love me. They just want what's best for me. If they tell me to do something and I don't do it, I get punished. If they tell me, hey, go clean your room or something and then you can have a piece of cake, I do something, I get rewarded for it. I'm faithful to what they've told me to do. I've carried out what they tell me to do. So there is a reward. You might look at it that way. In Christianity's case, heaven, being able to dwell with God. And I'll tell you this, there are a lot of Christians who sit on the pews on Sunday morning who could very much be in hell Sunday night. It's just that simple. No one wants to hear that. No one really wants to say that, but it's the truth. Because we think about everything that we should be doing, and we say, no, that's not for me. Evangelism is not for me. I'm not singing, or I'm not going to go to worship services, or I'm not going to do this, or I'm not going to do that, and what have you. And yet, I'm still faithful. Right? How many times have we known someone who, well, I'll give you an example. There's a funeral, well, early last year, that we had here at the building. Someone had passed away. They were members. Yes, obviously they passed away, Pam. Okay, look. I'm hot up here in the jacket even though I am wearing jeans. Give me a break. But had the funeral. And one of the things was, well, my mother, it was their mother who passed, she was a member here. At Freetown Road. Right? Hadn't been here in 10 years. Hadn't worshiped anywhere in 10 years. Now, I'm not judging that person. That's not my right. God's the judge. But I can sit there and speak as to what the Bible says. And how could anybody consider themselves a member of the Lord's church when they don't attend for a decade, to where not a single person here, because I asked, not a single person here had any clue who they were. Even though many of y'all have been here for decades and decades. We have to be faithful with God. God is faithful with us. And sometimes I can just picture him in heaven just shaking his head. What are you people thinking? How could you think I'd be pleased? Any thoughts or comments? Or does anybody want to throw like a rotten tomato or something at me? Okay. 10 and 11, they will walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. Indeed, he will roar, and his songs will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will settle them in their houses, declares the Lord. So even though there is a punishment that is coming, God talked in chapter 2, or through the prophet talked in chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, that he was going to take everything back. And then you remember a little bit later in the book, he starts talking that he's going to give some of that prosperity back to them. If you remember, we started talking about the cost of a slave and what have you, and how what he was giving back to them was not even going to be what a slave would be worth. And it was kind of a test. So I'm taking it all away because you had all of this prosperity, but you didn't give me any glory for it. Instead, you praised these idols and you went sacrificing to them. So I'm taking it all away, but at a time, I will give a little bit of it back to see if you've come to your senses, to see if you're going to glorify me. And they didn't. So now they're going to be carried off into Assyria, going into bondage. The armies of Assyria are going to come and start wiping people out. But then, even though there's that anger, even though they've turned away from God, there's the promise of restoration still, that they're going to be brought back. Again, that too should speak to us. You think of the prodigal son. Think of so many people who, they were once faithful Christians, and then they backslid, and then they backslid straight out the back door. And they say, you know what, I can't go back to services. I'm too far gone, or I've sinned too much, or I've done too much. No. God promises you come back, there is restoration there. Where do we think the problem is with someone coming back to the church? The people in the church. Heaven rejoices over a sinner who repents. Heaven rejoices over someone who is of the faith, who lost their faith and comes back. The problem is the people in the church, and that we have to, and I'm not trying to beat the church down, but we have to understand the concept of love and loving our brother just as, what did Christ say? Love one another just as what? As I have loved you. Yeah. Absolutely. Man, I would love to be able to do that. We have to be able to move on. We've got to let go of grudges and just, hey, welcome back, or welcome. You know, Jesus said, unless you become like a child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And think of how kids behave. 1 minute they can be the best of friends. The next minute they're fighting each other in the front yard. And then the very next day, hey, you want to go play over here? You know, you want to do that? Exactly. That type of forgiveness, that type of innocence. You know, will people sometimes look at us and say, wow, those Christians, they're really naive? Sure. And? You can call me whatever you want. Because what I want is God to call me faithful. I'd rather have God, you know, sit there and compliment me than the world, because ultimately He's the only one that matters. But there's this this promise of restoration couched in those statement there in 10 and 11. Yeah.
No, you're not. I've got 7,000. I've got a ring, out there that haven't bowed their knees to the Baal.
Yeah.
So, and when you think about that, there are people that are faithful, that are trying, but yet they get swept up in with the unfaithful. They get swept off into captivity, but yet they still remain faithful. And no matter where they are, what they're doing, they have that mindset of, it doesn't matter what the rest of these jokers are doing. I am going to do, we're just like God. I am going to do what the good Lord says.
Right.
And so, and be faithful. Whatever circumstance I'm in, whether I get swept up in captivity, the prophets even got taken off in captivity as well. So, just be faithful unto death. Where, as they always say, it's grow or flower wherever you're planted.
Yeah.
Bloom wherever you're planted. No matter where you are, be that bright spot.
No, absolutely. You know, Joshua 24:15, choose you this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And be with that commitment. Think about it. Most, and this is to kind of add to Clark's point, most service times, class times in the church or in most places, you know, you drive down the road, you see, okay, class at 9:30, worship at 10:30, right? Do we just see ourselves here, or do we really consider that right now, at this very moment, there are congregations all over the world of the Lord's people meeting together? Right? We are one body of people, but beyond that, we are individual Christians who have a responsibility to do what it is that God has called and God has commanded us to do. We so often seek the limelight, right? Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And if we think about Christ, did Christ ever seek the limelight? In fact, when there were crowds, most of the time, what did he do other than heal them or feed them? Yeah, he disappeared. He slipped away. I'm not here for my glory. I'm here for God's glory. I'm not trying to seek the limelight. And so many want to be in charge of something. And all that ends up is, too many cooks in the kitchen, or too many chiefs, not enough Indians, however you want to phrase it. Do what? I heard something about a kitchen, Peggy. But new in these two verses is this kind of lion simile for God, and the bird and the dove images for Israel there, and the role that they're playing. It's to strengthen the pictures of divine authority. Verse 12, Ephraim sounds with me the lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. Judah is also unruly against God, even against the Holy One who is faithful. The Holy One who is faithful. Ephraim surrounds me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. Did you have something? Oh, okay. So this new prophecy is coming in. Remember, the chapters and verses weren't added until much later. To serve God is to reign. But if we look at 1 Corinthians, I think it's 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 4. In verse 8, you are already filled, you have already become rich, you have become kings without us. Indeed, I wish that you had become kings, so that we might also reign with you. To serve God is to reign with God to a certain degree. We are never going to be as holy as God is, as pure as God is. But it's the idea that the concept is that we are rising above everything else. Our moral choices, the way that we conduct our lives, all of this is so much higher. Just again, Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts, they're so much higher than yours. Well, as Christians, we are to elevate ourselves through God's Word. That's not to look down at other people, but it's to make those more holy choices, if I can put it that way. Those choices that are more centered on God and less on us. We're supposed, Jesus said that when you're doing a good work, don't do it to be seen by other men. But when other men do see you, then they'll what? Glorify God in heaven. We're not seeking our own glory. Just as Christ said time and time again, I am not coming for my glory. I'm not coming for my own glory. I'm coming for God's. And if you're there on Wednesday nights when we're studying through the Gospel according to John, we notice that he says, I'm not even saying anything of my own. I'm saying what God has told me to do. I'm doing what God has told me to do. I'm saying what God tells me to say. Any thoughts or comments? And then we'll just go ahead and go through and read verse 12. Or do you want to read through verse 12 and start, chapter 12 and start? Or do you want to wait till next week and start fresh in chapter 12? Wait. Okay, so we'll go into there. We'll pick up Hosea chapter 12 and get through there. You may Google, or if you've got a study Bible or something, look at the different winds that there are in the Bible. Winds, Now I got to sanitize them. But the different winds, specifically the east wind and the west wind, and how they relate to God. Because that's in the beginning of chapter 12. That's where it's kind of pick up. Well, I appreciate the comments and the interactions, and I hope y'all enjoyed.